Relax. It's ASMR. The rise of modern thinking. Before we attempt to gain a better understanding of the contemporary ramifications of Calvin's theology and anthropology, we must first discuss the wider cultural context of Europe in Calvin's time and briefly trace the development of Western thought. The Renaissance gave birth to scientific, philosophic, and theological ideas that challenged long-held traditional views of man and nature. From the beginning, the Enlightenment set itself to figuring out the verbs of the world: motion, action, and energy. The mathematician, philosopher, and nascent physicist Descartes, and this is not how you spell his name, postulated that motion was achieved by the application of energy, and that energy was transferred from one object to another through direct contact. No longer was the motion of an object explained by its inherent nature. We could now explain, describe, calculate, and predict motion. The human mind no longer needed to receive knowledge passively as predetermined answers, but could recreate new knowledge through the posing of questions, applying rational thought, making observations, and arriving at theories that could better predict and describe the world. As more men and women made more accurate predictions about the world, the power of the rational mind, when coupled with practical observations, became self-evident, and rationalism transitioned into empiricism. Turning theories into proofs by repeatable experiments and accurate documentation strengthened the power of the rational process and became known as the scientific method. Challenging previous explanations and questioning common assumptions became the engine that drove human progress. The goal was not to find the final answer, but to find the next best explanation and subsequently replace it with an even more accurate explanation. I use explanation twice there. It definitely helps to read this out loud. One of the first teachings of the Church to fall to the Enlightenment was the centrality of humanity's position in the universe. This initial challenge to church dogma indicated the future course of Western philosophy, science, and culture. The more observations we made and knowledge we gained, the more realistic the view of our position and power within the universe became. The reaction to this new knowledge shaped the course of Western culture. Before, there was a thick fog of ignorance which hid reality from us. A great veil of unknowing kept us from clearly understanding ourselves and the world in which we lived. As cultural and scientific advancements have pulled back the veil of unknowing, people have not always liked the reality exposed, and it has forced us to grapple with questions that used to have reassuring answers. This new knowledge raised an immediate question. If the Church's teaching had been so wrong about the universe and our place in it, how could it be trusted to give guidance on other matters? Of course, the early Enlightenment... Let's see. I don't need those words. The early Enlightenment thinkers did not reject the worldview of the Church all at once. Their efforts to better describe their world were very much in the mindset of a theist, describing the world as God created, ruled, and directed it. Later, philosophers called into question the extent of God's active role in directing and maintaining the universe. The ascending view of the world was of its mechanical nature. As humans built more complex machines and better understood the power needed to keep them running, the deist could see the possibility of a world created and set in motion by God, but that the perfection of God's natural laws could continue without his constant intervention. As God's active role faded into the background, his creation became the focus of attention. Naturalism saw less and less need to refer to his causal influence and found a sufficient explanation in what they observed and understood. Western culture's understanding was growing exponentially, and it was clear that humanity was only a small part of a much bigger framework. So, at the same time that Western thinkers were letting go of their beliefs which gave meaning and context, the wider culture was finding the need for such things growing ever important. It seems that reality had its own lessons in humility to teach. As Western philosophy and science became untethered from the context the Church provided, there were no longer easy answers to important, uncomfortable questions. Each subsequent revelation of our place in the universe led closer to the uneasy question: what is humanity's purpose? The wonder and glory of new discoveries soon wore and began to fray at the edges. It was clear that not all new knowledge would be used to help forward human progress, but would be used to bring new suffering to the human experience. The nihilists saw no need to acknowledge God and saw no overarching purpose to humans' efforts. Human reason and morals had limits after all, and each new revelation from science only added to the absurdity of the human condition. The uneasy question could no longer be ignored. It threatened the dissolution of any meaningful reason to continue collective cultural efforts. Existentialism and utilitarianism attempt to counter this by separating humans from the mechanical fatalism that befalls everything else in the universe, and assigns to men and women the unique ability to define their purpose separate from their physical existence. Our context was now self-generated, our meaning continuously created moment by moment. But there is little comfort in simply knowing. As humans gained certainty in describing the universe, they lost certainty in how to morally apply that knowledge. The light of knowledge revealed more than we were comfortable with, more than we knew what to do with. But we cannot shut our eyes, stop our ears, and pretend that we do not know it. The progression of modern thought from theism to existentialism is a source of great consternation for people of all religious stripes, both Catholic and Protestant. The twofold challenge of the removal of the veil of unknowing and the posing of the uneasy question demands a response. History has shown that overall the Church is ill-equipped to handle these challenges in a nuanced manner. For the past 150 years, it has been in a progressively reactionary stance. This has led to a rejuvenation and intensification of Calvinism and the demandingness that it entails. Understanding this phenomena requires an examination of the role Calvinism has played in the shaping of American culture and history. The progress of Reformed thought in America. For all the changes that Calvin wanted to make to the way that Europe practiced the Christian religion, his desire for power and influence in the political sphere remained the same as that of the Catholic Church. As we have seen, Calvin saw the role of civil government as supportive and subservient to the authority of the Church. Some countries were more amenable to this relationship than others. England had a particularly complicated relationship with the Reformation. When Henry VIII, that is not 13, but 8, broke from the Catholic Church, he set up a hierarchy of power that was directly counter to Calvin's. In England, the Church was a product of the state, and so reforms primarily focused on the Church's power structure, establishing the head of the state and the head of the Church, establishing the head of the state as the head of the Church. Matters such as radically changing ceremonies, sacraments, and confessions were not the driving purpose of the English Reformation. When Mary I came to power, she attempted to restore the supremacy of the Catholic Church. The bloody persecution of Protestants drove many to Geneva, where they sought the protection of Calvin. Here, his teachings strongly influenced their theology and their ideas of the role of the Church in society. When Elizabeth I replaced her sister on the throne, her attempts to solidify her authority over the Church of England and strike a balance that would bring an end to the bloody persecution were met with pessimistic response from the strident reformers who sought to purify the religious expression of the Church and gain ascendancy over the authority of Queen Elizabeth in religious matters. The conflict between the Puritan movement and the Elizabethan Church of England ebbed and flowed between conflict and compromise. The advancement of the Protestant doctrine in England continued to grow, but any hopes the Puritans had of gaining control over the Church began to wane with the death of one of their greatest champions, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. As the Puritans lost influence in the Queen's court and in Parliament, it increasingly saw them as Queen's Court. This should be like which. It should be they. They increasingly saw them as troublers of the state. End of sentence. In the conflict that grew from this change in status, the state put several prominent Puritan leaders on trial, but each refused to take an oath promising to answer the questions of the court. Because of this impasse, the matter moved to the Star Chamber, which, while it pronounced no definitive judgments, marked the end of the Puritans' movement's influence. For the rest of the reign of the government, vigilant against the least overt demonstration of the old radical spirit, effectively outlawed Puritanism. For some within the Puritan community, this situation was untenable. They could not be like the neuters, people content to go to church with any hint of Catholic practices. For them, there was no room for compromise, and the New World provided an opportunity for them to establish and shape a new system of rule more in line with the spiritual and moral dictates of their faith. No recounting of America's founding would be complete without the story of the Puritan Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, and the First Thanksgiving. The very term Puritan Pilgrims tells us much that we need to know about the roots of religion in this country. The term speaks of the desire to establish a society shaped by a pure, untainted expression of their Reformation religious values. I think I can take out the word religious. A desire so strong that the group uprooted themselves from their homes and took a pilgrimage to a new land where they could firmly establish, finally, the right and proper way for men and women to live under God's law and guidance. This desire for religious independence is a key tenet in this country's founding. It is about freedom, but it is also about control. The freedom of religious expression is also the freedom to establish a reality independent of any outside influence not acknowledged by the group. This desire for control has ebbed and flowed throughout the history of this country. But the increase in opposition to traditionally held beliefs by modern and postmodern thought have activated and strengthened those core Calvinistic ideologies. In the last century, leaders of the modern Reformed movement have rejuvenated, developed, and propagated Calvin's theology into a movement which seeks to establish control over the rules of what is and isn't truth. This control manifests as a demandingness to know and guarantee certain results. To the reformers, this seemed like a noble refusal to compromise with differing opinions, framed as a righteous struggle to defend the faith. One strength of Calvin was his ability to state his position meticulously. His Institutes of the Christian Religion is a detailed explanation of his interpretation of Scripture that leads the reader through the tenets of Calvinism. I don't think that's spelled correctly. Point by point. It is a tour de force of logic that expounds upon and strengthens its main points, while it also defends them against opposing positions. The modern Reformed movement continues in this same tradition. There may be no more new worlds to sail to, but through their efforts they have carved out of the American culture a separate, ideologically pure space, cut off from the complications associated with the removal of the veil of unknowing and the posing of the uneasy question. The theological and philosophical foundations of the modern Reformed movement were laid down by one of the founding professors of the Westminster Theological Seminary, Cornelius Van Til. His work, A Christian Theory of Knowledge, draws a bright line of demarcation between the Christian and the rest of society. To Van Til, communication between a Christian and a non-Christian is an impossibility, because they do not share a common reality. Quote, "The Protestant doctrine of God requires that it be made foundational to everything else as explanatory. Then he must be the final reference point for all human predication. He then, like the sun from which all light on earth derives the power of illumination. You do not use a candle in order to search for the sun. The idea of a candle is derived from the sun. So the very idea of any fact in the universe is that it is derivative. God has created it. It cannot have come into existence by itself or by chance. God himself is the source of all possibility and therefore of all space-time factuality. On the other hand, if God is not self-sufficient and self-explanatory, and he is no longer the... Okay, I think that's a wrong word. Then I'll have to look that up. Then he is no longer the final reference point in human predication. When God and man become partners in an effort to explain a common environment, facts then are not what they are. In the last analysis, by virtue of God's plan, they are partly that, but they partly exist of their own power. The human mind then need not subject itself to the revelation of God as absolutely authoritative for him. Man may then differ to God as to an expert who has a greater experience than himself, but he need not make all thoughts captive to the obedience of Christ. The Christian cannot, in this view, indicate to the non-Christian that a non-Christian's position is destructive of experience, nor can he make plain to the non-Christian that Christianity will give him, and will certainly give him, what he needs. Any autonomy ascribed to man implies a detraction from the self-sufficiency of God. It implies that God can no longer be taken as the final reference point in human predication. Reformed theology holds to the self-sufficiency of God without compromise. It therefore rejects every form of human autonomy. Only in the assumptions of divine self-sufficiency and man's complete dependence upon God can the difference between the Christian and the non-Christian point of view be clearly made out. End of quotes. This is the core tenet of Reformed presuppositionalism. Until the non-believer agrees to presuppose the existence and authority of God, there can be no meaningful exchanges between the two sides. Von Til progresses the theology and anthropology of Calvin to its next logical step, stating that man's inability to see the facts as they are and to reason about them as he ought to reason about them is, at the bottom, a matter of sin. For Von Til, the primary conflict revolves around the question of authority and certainty, which he establishes solely for all matters in the pages of Scripture. It alone tells us what is true. To say that Scripture testifies to itself and therefore identifies itself is to imply that it also identifies every fact in the world. That is to say, the God of which the Scripture speaks is the God who makes the facts to be what they are. There can therefore be no fact which is ultimately out of accord with the system of truth set forth in Scripture. Every fact in the universe is what it is just because of the place it has in this system. The Christian holds to the authority and finality of the Bible not because he can clearly, that is, exhaustively show the cohesion of every fact with every other fact of Scripture, but rather holds this doctrine of Scripture because unless he does, there is no resting point for the search of facts anywhere. In this view of the world, humanity completely depends on God to establish any part of reality, meaning that reality is entirely encompassed by and found only in Scripture. Any effort by humankind to reason or question beyond these bounds is fruitless and can only lead to corruption. The popular Christian philosopher Francis Schaeffer takes up this argument against human reason. In his book, Escape from Reason, Schaeffer makes the argument that the writings of Thomas Aquinas set the stage for the error of the Enlightenment. Since then, humanity's use of reason has expressed in art, education, and culture have been, quote, killing grace. Similar to Von Til, Schaeffer believes that art and science only find their truest expression under the revelation of Scripture, that there is nothing autonomous, nothing apart from the lordship of Jesus Christ and the authority of Scripture. In this framework, the posing of the uneasy question is a sign of degeneration that threatens the true purpose and expression of the gospel, which can only flourish in the sterile environment of certainty. While Schaeffer was making his case against human reason in modern culture, Von Til's ideas were being further developed by Russia John Rushdoony, a Presbyterian missionary, champion of the early homeschool movement, and founder of the conservative political activist group, the Chalcedon Foundation. I may have an extra space there. In his book, The Institutes of Biblical Law, Rushdoony makes a series of arguments that directly flow from the legacy of Calvin, the Puritans, and Von Til. If human reason is corrupt and cannot recognize or choose good, then humans cannot govern themselves and so must come under the authority and control of God's law. Rushdoony saw the church as the direct descendants of, quote, the Israel of old. His book is an attempt to rescue the church from the influence of humanistic and evolutionary thought, and is intended as a beginning, as an instituting consideration of that law, which must govern society and which shall govern society under God. Rushdoony proceeds to lay out a case that sees the death of Christ not as a fulfillment of the law, but as an intensification of it. He places on the church a responsibility as the new chosen people of God to do that which Adam in Eden and Israel in Canaan failed to do. One and the same covenant, under differing administrations, still prevails. Man is summoned to create the society God requires. The determination of man and of history is from God, but the reference of God's law is to this world. To be spiritually minded is life and peace. And to be spiritually minded does not mean to be otherworldly, but to apply the mandates of the written word under the guidance of the Spirit to this world. Rushdoony sees the covenant of the Old Testament as a contract that has yet to be fulfilled, and that the restoration of the covenant relationship was the work of Christ, His grace in His elect people. The fulfillment of that covenant is their great commission, to subdue all things and all nations to Christ and His law word. Thus we see Calvin's theology and anthropology reach its logical conclusion and invigorate a resurgence of a reformed movement that sees power, rule, and control as its God-given mandate. Modern society is not just to be resisted, but dominated and made to submit to a theonomy. In this system, the church and the state are one, and the aisles of the church lead directly to the halls of power. The influence of these three men and others like them on modern politics is extensive. They have been successful in carving the church out from its surrounding society and setting it in direct conflict with that society. This leads to the baffling contradiction of a majority white evangelical population seeing themselves as marginalized and persecuted. The modern expression of conservative American Christian evangelicalism is driven by a desire for independence and control more than by any other force. It is the same demanding, reactionary stance of Calvin and the Puritans that has led to separation, disengagement, and hostility that fosters alienation, disgust, and resentment. The ramifications of the obstinate need to be right. The medieval Catholic Church, Calvin, and the modern Church have in common the same drive for power and control. In order to be the arbiters of certainty and the defenders of truth, they must possess the ability to enforce the correctness of their position and the power to silence opposing viewpoints. This need has progressed to such an extent that the primary mission of the conservative Christianity in America today is to be right, to be certain, and to be unquestioned in its position, independent and separate from those who are not right, pure in expression and thought. There is no inherent cultural narrative from within the church that validates the importance of scientific discovery or the love of knowledge outside of Scripture, because since its inception, Calvin discouraged rational thought and denigrated the effectiveness of human reason. This general antagonism towards the intellect has worked itself out in a variety of ways that have intensified over time. The discovery of the evolutionary process that provided an alternative explanation to the literal six-day creation and a 6,000-year-old Earth activated defense mechanisms within the church that marked the beginning of a more aggressive stance against science and reason. There are those who attempt to combat evolution with alternative interpretations and timelines. Organizations such as Answers in Genesis attempt to find scientific evidence that backs up their literal interpretation of the creation narrative. These attempts to maintain the framework of science while disputing the results are based on a misunderstanding of the mechanisms on which systems of thought operate. These efforts only pantomime the actions of discovery while hollowing out the foundations of scientific rigor and intellectual honesty that make them effective. They have attempted to set up an alternative reality that fits their presupposed beliefs about how the universe should operate. This, when coupled with the homeschool movement and a mobilized vocal electorate demanding that public schools teach specific religious viewpoints on equal footing as scientific efforts, leads to a generation of Christians who lack a basic foundation in rational thought and do not value evidence-based research. This suits the goal of the church well, as it provides a base of motivated members who see their battle against science and intellectualism as a moral and spiritual one. The end result is a system with no checks and balances to correct for larger errors in reasoning. As such, the pseudoscientific frameworks have gradually been discarded for a purer form of belief in Scripture. The flat earth and geocentric movements have progressed from a fringe conspiracy theory to belief systems that have made inroads into the mainstream Christian church, with curricula being written for homeschools and Christian school classrooms. Scripture is all the evidence needed to prove that the earth is flat or that the sun orbits the earth. The same pattern of anti-science can be seen in the recent rise of antagonism towards vaccines within the evangelical Christian community. Misleading information about the contents of vaccines have prompted families to abandon the practice of immunization in sufficient numbers to compromise herd immunity in some areas of the country, and the devaluation of scientific evidence have left them hostile to facts that counter their beliefs. The opinions and beliefs of the individual, no matter how ill-informed, are validated and reinforced by like-minded cohorts in the church, and capitalized on by those looking to promote themselves and their beliefs. These examples can seem to be extreme, but they indicate a wider mindset within contemporary conservative Christianity that is progressively more isolated, ignorant, and hostile to the culture in which they are embedded. Modern Christian teaching has not equipped them with the tools to process or communicate with the wider culture in an effective way other than a dogmatic insistence that their views be validated, taught, and enforced. Ultimately, by questioning the validity of scientific discovery and the trustworthiness of basic facts, the contemporary conservative church has undermined their own cause and strengthened the position of nihilism. To be sure, this black and white thinking is evident in other aspects of Western culture. Christians do not have a monopoly on ignorance, but it is the purpose of this paper to examine the roots of American conservative Christian dogma, since the elements of belief lend a certain ferocity to their insistence that they are right. It creates a movement that is opposed to the current social order, deeply skeptical or openly hostile to scientific advancements, and philosophically opposed to compromise. A tremendous amount of the energy and focus of the American conservative Christian church goes into ensuring that it and its members are certain and in control.